Before we start this video, I want to give a quick shout out to my buddy Rommy. Without her help, this video would not have been possible as she supplied the initial idea and my brain decided at 4 AM it was a good idea to start cooking with it. You can check out all her lore companion stuff in the description below. If you ever need a refresher on 14's story or lore, her write-ups are some of the best. And with that out of the way, I hope you enjoyed this video. Final Fantasy XIV ENDWALKER is, in more ways than one, a swan song to the last 10 years of Final Fantasy XIV. Its main story upon release was the end to the first story arc of Final Fantasy XIV and set the stage for the next 10 years, giving major and side characters one massive send-off, really making you feel like the last 10 years of content had mattered if you actually did it, with side characters appearing in cutscenes depending on content completion. Even in the patch content, we get side quests like Tataru's Grand Endeavor, where we get to spend a quest or two with fan-favorite characters we haven't seen in major roles since their respective expansions. Both the 8-man and 24-man of ENDWALKER also deal with long-running characters and myths, Pandemonium being a send-off for two major villains and somewhat of a rewrite for the Ascian La Habrea, who sadly was a product of early writing and is locked to that due to presumably contracts and payment. If only there was a way to remake A Realm Reborn with a new budget using an engine just freshly made by the same team. Myths of the Realm finally gives us details and revelations about the game's initial 12 gods and reveal what they really are. Though, at the time of writing this, we're a few weeks away from the final revelations of that storyline, but I think so far it's given a very good idea of what is actually going on with them. Like I said, ENDWALKER is a capstone to many storylines that have been around for the last 10 years. And then, there's the Manor-filled Weapons questline. In an expansion filled to the brim with endings and beginnings, the choice to make a Relic storyline just a side to a comedy questline gave us the game's first quest-based weapon progression. The Grind, a Relic is known for, is 3 expansions and 4 trials worth of side quests you may or may not have done. While liking or disliking this Relic is a constant debate between long-running players such as myself and babies who just started playing in Shadowbringers and ENDWALKER, objectively, the Relic quest always had a story. One that amounted to more than naked man sweats onto your weapon and it glows now. Now more naked men stand around to sweat on weapons for you. Creating sentient, ever-growing weapons via the steps of the world-renowned Zodiac Braves, creating a brand new soul with your very life essence and memories, uncovering the ancient secrets of Save the Queen and learning just what Auracite can truly do with weapons and runes tied directly to saving a country and its inhabitants from an empire's grasp. So in an expansion that's all about sending off long-running storylines, they decided to just not bother with Gerald's long-running storyline with various artisans and NPCs as he works off his constant debt to his ex-wife Rowena, only to regain it by drinking. Nah, I'm not standing for that. We go to Radzed Hans in this expansion. 2 of the 5 major NPCs related to creating relics are from there, and we even meet a family member of one of them. So, let's pretend that dev resources aren't being wasted on side content like a spreadsheet simulator you run out of stuff to do within a week or 2 of the patch dropping. Let's refresh back to 6.2 and do it differently. My dear viewer, here is my pitch for an actual relic questline, the Weapons of Azem. So, the Weapons of Azem. The name itself should give away its entire gimmick. After multiple weapon lines of weapons based on old stories or creating mass-produced weapons, this time, you're working to create the ultimate weapon for the Warrior of Light. Weapons to call the very stars to your side. First things first. In this hypothetical, universe, the Manor-filled weapons still exist. They act as a reward for doing the Hildebrand questline to completion. Each even patch comes with an upgrade to act as a catch-up weapon for people who need a quick weapon upgrade after being away for a while, only being tied behind tombstones and doing Hildebrand. The eye levels of the weapons will be below relics, but above the unupgraded tombstones. With this, they can also tie the more goofy and out there designs of the weapon contests and add glows to them, without giving us an entire tombstone set that's just more Crusader or Paladin armor with barely matching weapons. So thanks to these acting as raw catch-up weapons with minimal effort to unlock, we can be a little more annoying about the Relic's initial requirements. That's right, I'm gonna say it. This Relic requires prerequisites, and I'm not playing around with them. To start the Weapons of Azem questline, the following needs to be done. Finished at least 1 Zodiac Zeta weapon and finish the Zodiac weapon questline. Finished at least 1 Anima Lux weapon and finish the Anima weapon questline. Finished at least 1 Eurekan weapon and finish the story of Eureka the Forbidden Land, not counting completion of Baldician's arsenal. I'm not evil. Finished at least 1 Resistance Law weapon. Due to the Resistance Law weapon quest being tied to but not required to have done most Save the Queen content, you don't have to complete Save the Queen. So that's a pretty decently steep requirement, right? Well, this way, anybody who hasn't done either Eureka or Save the Queen but want these weapons are forced to go back in and repopulate the areas. I know quite a few people are stuck in Save the Queen's 24-man because not a lot of people are doing it, and it requires a tiny bit of extra effort to even do without spending 60 minutes in there. I will say there will be one more requirement by the end, but we'll get there when we get there. Once again, like I said earlier, in this world, they didn't decide to make the island sanctuary. Instead, they take what they've learned from both Baja and Zatnor and enhance it further, introducing the exploratory content, the Corvos Highlands. Leftover running amok blasphemies and tempered Garlean soldiers roam these highlands, and it's up to you to help the warriors of the G tribe in Corvos to help and free their home. However, instead of multiple maps like Eureka and Save the Queen, the Corvos Highlands instead are one massive map split into two. A giant wall divides the highlands and the outskirts of the city, and it's up to you to actually kill the final blasphemy living there, being protected by the tempered Garleans after the being who turned was merged alongside another part of Varys that fell from the Tower of Babel that was situated in that area. This requires a map bigger than usual, but we saw with Island Sanctuary they aren't afraid of increasing map size. Plus, with the PS5 now in the game and the PS3 no longer holding stuff back, they don't have to be afraid of map sizes and player amount causing too much of a problem. The release pipeline would follow the footsteps of Baja. 6.2 would introduce the two storylines of Corvos and the Azem weapons. 6.3 would see the first half of the Corvos Highlands released with an open dungeon at the end and a giant wall barring entry for the rest of the zone. 6.4 would give us a 24-man dungeon, where the giant wall is actually a stronghold and you and your friends try to shut down the wall from the inside to open up Corvos, with a 48-man hard mode and a mount. 6.5 would release the second half of the Highlands and lead you into the Corvos city outskirts. One final open dungeon to finish off that storyline. So that will be the open zone, but like Baja, you get options for the weapons. The weapons of a Zem questline would have items that you can get by trading in items dropped from bosses in Corvos, but while each step can be completed by doing the Corvos storyline, you'd also get regular content options. With this time, the 24-man mention not being hard required for a weapon, instead giving you another option to grind alongside because, let's face it, people will stop doing content. But with that out of the way, let's talk about the would-be storyline of the weapons of Azem. Geralt, for once, isn't in debt to Rowena, and is just on a pleasure trip to Radzet Hans, where he meets you. He asks you to join him for a drink at the tavern and tell of your adventures after he heard you went ahead and saved the star from destruction. After telling Geralt of your adventures, he is moved, perhaps by the copious amount of alcohol consumed during your retelling of events, but nonetheless inspired by your tales of the ancients and the Zem to create the ultimate weapon. When who happens to pass by, but Rowena herself. Rowena offers to fund this transaction, but under the condition that Geralt works under her for a secret project we're not allowed to know about. Geralt, hesitant, but just drunk enough to say yes to anything, agrees and is drafted off by Rowena. You find him later recovering from the alcohol and standing at the forges in Radzet Hans, unaware of what Rowena actually is putting him up to. He, however, is more determined than ever to start work on his magnum opus, weapons worthy of the title of Azem, for the realm's savior themselves. This spark of inspiration and Rowena's gracious offerings of materials, he calls upon his apprentice Drake, who is en route to Radzet Hans. Before long, Drake arrives and the two begin work on your brand new weapon. The two grant you the first in what promises to be a long line of upgrades. However, while Geralt has ideas for weapons beyond this one, he'll need special oil that Rowena's merchants sell in Radzet Hans. Thanks to Corvos not being released until 6.3, 6.2's weapons will be a freebie, requiring the same 1,500 tombstones per weapon as the actual relic weapons of ENDWALKER. These weapons would resemble your ENDWALKER artifact armor with no glow. These weapons wouldn't have individual names, all weapons being titled Star Shepherds. So Star Shepherd's Codex, Rod, Sword and Shield, you know, those kinds of things. Geralt calls upon you and tells you that he has come up with the next step in upgrading your weapons to be the pinnacle of the star. He tells you he has called in the help of an associate you haven't met before, as Jalzahn appears from behind Geralt. After a brief reintroduction and another heartfelt thank you for helping him create the Zeta weapons, Jalzahn tells you that he's more than happy to provide help in creating weaponry for the Star Savior. This conversation is interrupted as Geralt is dragged away by Rowena's associates, which you learn has been happening frequently in your absence. However, he begrudgingly trusts Jalzahn to be able to handle the process. Jalzahn tells you that in the time since you collected those many Atmas for him, He's found out a way to draw out all of the power from the crystallized chunks, and wants to use this on your weapons to bring out their peak. For this, he asks you to collect more Atmas, requiring 20 so-called Neo-Atmas. You recall the harrowing memories of your first round of Atma hunting, but he bids you seek out the strongest opponents you can find and return to him. Neo-Atmas are dropped from critical engagements in the Corvus Highlands, a 100% drop rate per major engagement, or a low 20% drop rate from killing random mobs and partaking in the various fates in the area. Fates in ENDWALKER areas also drop Neo-Atmas, a 60% drop rate per fate, and the ability to buy one per 500 bicolor gemstones. When you return to Jalzan and hand over the 20 Neo-Atmas, he quickly begins deconstructing these crystallized masses of aether into puddles of various colors via his own homemade alchemical formulas. You hand over your weapon and watch as the weapon is dipped into the vat of swirling colors. What comes out, however, is an obviously strengthened weapon, and Jalzan's face shines as he tells you to pick up your new and improved weapon. Geralt returns, grumbling under his breath just in time to see the newly improved weapons. Geralt grins in response to his work being able to take up Jalzan's with alchemic tests, and the two argue, leaving you to return to your busy duties as Warrior of Light. With 20 Neo-Atmas gained from either Corvus or Fates and ENDWALKER zones, you've upgraded your Star Shepherd weapon into the alchemical Star Shepherd weapons. A glow now goes all over the weapon, like in usual fashion. The Neo-Atmas, if you do it via Fates in the overworld, aren't tied to any specific zone. You're free to grind in whatever zone you want. 60% drop rate is a pretty high drop rate, avoiding the initial issues of the original Atma quest. Plus, with the bicolor gems being an option in case you are just that unlucky, which, knowing 14, it's very possible. In a moment of respite between adventures, you once again are contacted by Geralt. He tells you that he has sent out word for Ardashir and he will arrive at Aratzad Hands at any moment and requests you there for the next step in the weaponry. While Geralt is nowhere to be seen, Ardashir is overjoyed to see you again after your work together in Ozzy's Law, and after a brief hello from the Anima themselves, you and your comrades focus on what needs to be done for the Zem weapons to flourish more. Ardashir mentions that combining the aether from all of the Neo-Atmas that you and Jalzan put into the weapons are too much for the weapon's current body, and to further enhance will require two things: Arasite to hold the aether more properly, and a new body for the weapon to encase the Arasite properly without fear of tempering those around you. While Ardashir is capable, with the help of Jalzan, to safely transfer all of the current aether housed in a weapon to a new host, the act of actually getting an Arasite is a whole different problem. Something as precious as white Arasite is incredibly hard for even Rowena to get her hands on, and trying to get some from Damaska itself is no longer an option after your recent adventure into the Orbon Monastery. You, however, come up with a new plan. You can think of a place to procure brand new Arasite without much hassle, and you mentioned that recently you helped deal with a figure seemingly related to Ultima from the distant past. Not once to pry in the adventures of a time traveler, they ask you to try and find out more info where you can. They will stay here and prep the necessary objects. You travel to Elpis and arrive at the gates of Pandemonium, where you're greeted by a word of La Habrea and his companion, whose appearances are practically identical to Rowena and Geralt. The two tell you that La Habrea has told them of your adventures and they wanted to meet such an important familiar of a Zem. You try to explain that you're in search of a stone capable of sealing and holding souls called Arasite for a project you're working on for, quote-unquote, the Zem. While the two have no idea what Arasite is, they tell you that they can just create what you need from scratch, although they will require some materials. They explain that it seems like Arasite isn't wholly unlike the crystals they use to house concepts, but to house souls is a different thing altogether. However, they think they can create exactly what you need if you help them with a collection of aether potent enough to create the stone. They hand you a device that can capture the aether of fallen enemies and bid you explore to your heart's content and return when the device is filled. You can now start collecting aether from fallen enemies in instance content. Different bosses and trials give different amounts of aether. A total of 1,500 aether is required for the completion of the stone. The side 24 man related to Corvus Highlands will grant a higher amount of light per boss defeated in there, but you have the option to just do normal instance content while working on this weapon. Return to Elpis with a fully charged aether beacon and hand it to Daedalus and Pania. Impressed by the volume of aether you've collected over such a short period of time, you joke that this isn't your first time capturing aether into small objects. While the two are fascinated and would love to hear more of your travels, they instead focus on the matter at hand. They ask you to close your eyes and hold out your hand and imagine the object in your mind's eye. In an instant, the Arasite is created and in your hand. They thank you for your help in procuring the aether and bid you return if you ever want another Arasite or require help again. With brand new Arasite in hand, you arrive back in Razad Hands to show to your comrades. You enter the forge room and see Jalzan and Ardashir in a shocked state, as you find them staring at Geralt in a tailor-fit suit. Embarrassed and grumbling to himself, asking for everybody to just pretend he isn't currently dressed up, you hand over the aura sight to Ardashir and tell the group about what transpired back in Elpis. Impressed by the product of creation magic, Ardashir wastes no time in transferring the ether in your weapon to the aura sight. While you were gone, the two came up with the new designs to house the aura sight, and now that Gerald has changed back into his half-naked drunken self, he is fueled and ready to hammer away a brand new casing and take a step further towards the ultimate weapon. In the blink of an eye, Gerald finishes the new weapon. Just holding the weapon fills you with the passion to explore new horizons. Gerald bids you return with new Arasite, and he'll use the plans drawn up by Jalzan and Ardashir to create more weapons if you need. So if it wasn't obvious, for this quest, completion of Pandemonium is required. I figured for a weapon that bears the title of a Zem, it'd be a good thing to actually have some creation magic in there. I also don't think it's too much of an issue to have Pandemonium be required to be complete in the future of the game. People will always be doing 8-man raids, and this is just a good boost for future-proofing the content. However, unlike Baja, this time you're not required to run the extra 24-man just to finish a relic. I know it's a bit of an issue to play catch-up in a piece of content you need to do multiple times for a weapon that can run up to 60 minutes per run due to missing out on damage from special drops. I also figured, listen, Gerald and Rowena are already on the first as Grenold and Moen. Why not go the full route and have their unsundered selves actually be a thing as far back as then? Their souls are connected as much as they don't want to admit it on their source variants. Also, light farming. I mean, if you ask me, light farming is always fun. You can do it wherever and whenever you want, and it's passive and just fun. Giving you a quicker option by doing the Corvus 24-man, but allowing you to do just your roulettes and stuff is good prep for 7.x and beyond when people just don't run it as much anymore, compared to when the release is and its current. These weapons would be a new model and immediately have a glow, but you can get a non-glowy replica if you so wish. With a new model comes a new name. Instead of a catch-all Star Shepherd-like title, these weapons all have special names. However, I'm not even gonna pretend to be clever enough to come up with names that fit for the jobs. You know, like Woebringer, Veil of Wiyu, you know, all of those like quote-unquote artifact relics, if that makes sense. So just pretend I came up with something clever there. They also let you put in custom stats because tradition. Any stat change would require some special oil gotten from tombstones. Arriving in Rat's hands, Gerald tells you that they've come up with the final step regarding the weapons of a Zem, and he tells you the final member of the group will be arriving soon. Stepping into the room, you're greeted by Zlatan, who assures that the rebuilding of Baja has been going smoothly, assuring that if you ever wanted to come back and help in rebuilding Baja, you'd be welcomed with open arms. Gerald begins explaining that to bring the weapons to its strongest form and really embody a Zem, it will require the runes and knowledge of the Gunhilder's blades you work together on to recreate. Zlatan tells you that adding runes to the weapons is fine, but it won't do much with its current body. The combination of raw aether swirling in the outer side, the ever-growing strength from fighting in your journeys, and the runes to enhance it to its max would only lead to the weapon eventually destroying itself. What you need is a weapon base that can hold an unlimited amount of aether, something practically impossible. Ardashir then mentions your recent forays into the past might help in this conundrum, having heard rumors of the ancients and their seemingly unlimited supply of ether. You travel to Elpis to find Daedalus near the gates of Pandemonium. He greets you and asks if you need more Arasite. You tell him that instead of creating Arasite, you need to create a weapon capable of holding an unlimited amount of ether to stop itself from potentially blowing up or implode. He says that creating a weapon like that is an easy feat, but he will need a bit of help in return for doing this. His wife Penia has a bit of a boutique set up in Amarat and has been tasked that on his off time he finds knickknacks from across the world for her to sell to her like-minded clientele. His job as part of the Wards of La Brea is keeping him busy, but as Zem's familiar should be able to come across various knickknacks around the world with no problem. He asks you to collect 5 of 3 specific items and bring them to him. When done, he will use his creation magic to help create the weapon. The critical engagements in the Corvo's Highland now drop specific items in specific zones on the map. You can also get these items from level 70, 80, and 90 dungeons, albeit with a lower drop rate. I want to say about 50, 60 compared to the 100% from Corvos. You just have to be using the weapons of a Zem in the content for the item to drop. Once more, you return to Elpis to find Daedalus. You grant him the various knickknacks collected over the course of your recent travels. Impressed by the variety, he won't question what far-flung places you collected these from. Once again, he asks you to hold out your hand and close your eyes, telling you to imagine the very concept of the weapon and the ideal you're trying to create. Before long, a crystal is in your hand. Daedalus bids you farewell and says that if you need more concept crystals made, he can always supply more for more knickknacks. You come back to Razad Hans to find the group of artisans having an argument about 12 knows what. You interrupt the impending screaming match with news about your travels to the past. You hand the concept crystal over to Gerald, who as soon as he holds the crystal has the look of a man who just met God. Without word, he runs to the anvil and begins hammering away like a man possessed. You and your friends can only watch in horror as he toils away for what feels like hours. Suddenly, Gerald stops in his tracks. With the sound of his hammer falling to the ground, kneeling and near death, Gerald tells the rest to work the magic on the weapon. Before long, Jalzan and Ardashir have transferred the aura sight into the new weapon, with Zlatan quickly applying the special runes. You hold the weapon aloft, but something is still missing: experience. Zlatan tells you that before the weapon truly is completed, it'll need heaps of experience of traveling with you, which could potentially take a long while. Ardashir interjects that you've already done that for the anima before, and could replicate it with less effort than before. Due to your ever-expanding list of dangers faced, Ardashir asks you that while you're holding your weapon, you think back to your recent forays against fearsome enemies. The thought of that should be enough to kickstart your weapon. In your mind's eye, you think back to your most fearsome enemies faced. You recall your first experience dealing with a realm-destroying threat, none other than the dreaded Ultima weapon, and how Hydaelyn risked her life to help you deal with the immediate threat that seemed undefeatable. But together with the crystals of light and the hopes of your friends did you manage to pull the power of the primals from the heart of Sabik, laying low the elegant monstrosity and rescuing Thancred from the clutches of the Asian La Habrea. You think back to King Thornton and his Heavensward, how you and your friends stood steadfast against the primal born of the hopes and prayers of a 1,000-year-long war, how when you stood victorious against him, the broken man saw nothing but despair in his own quest for justice against you. Had the final days been occurring during that period, you might have had to deal with another threat immediately after his transformation, but that is in the past. Not many other trials you faced are as vivid as your fight against Shinryu and Xenos. How on top of El Amigo, you and your comrades faced off against a primal born of the despair and wishes of a country's citizens. You stood victorious as your fight took you to the heavens above and watched as a man who finally saw light in his life for the first time seemingly took his own, knowing he'd never recaptured that one glorious moment. In another life, in another time, perhaps you and the self-proclaimed Sorcerer of Eld might have come to an understanding. Alas, it wasn't meant to be, for his ideals stood strong. His ideals were for all intents and purposes invincible. And in those ideals, you and your friends should not and could not exist. And thus the you and Hades fight, a battle for dominion of the very star and its reflections. You recall the final strike you and your friends delivered to Hades, and his request for those who have risen to remember those who have fallen, to remember the ancients and their role in the star. Across the far edge of fate rang blades of hope and despair, of light and darkness. You, Xenos, and your friends stood against the ultimate incarnation of despair itself, a misguided attempt from a girl who just wanted to help and understand people. You think back to how you could hear your friends rooting for you in that area of pure dynamism, and how you managed to overcome pure despair with the hopes and dreams of not just your star, but the entirety of creation. How at the end of it all, you showed Medion the memories of your journeys, the beauty, the sadness, the joys and sorrows, a journey of loss, fire, and fate. With the memories of your most fearsome foes swirling in not only your mind but in the weapon, you open your eyes and fight the weapon glowing with a brilliant light. Your friends are standing in awe at the shining brilliance of your finished weapon. After an incredibly long road and many tasks, you finally wield what could be compared to the very stars themselves. After creating weapons based on old legends, myths, and deeds passed throughout the ages, you now hold a weapon all your own, based on you and your legacy. Using the story of Azem, you now hold the power of the stars in your hands. Gerald, Drake, Jalzan, Ardashir, and Zlatan congratulate you and each other on a well-done job. But in the distance, a darkness gathers. So this is a two-step victory lap, with the first part acting as the bulk of the grind. Once you complete the first step, you're granted a weapon with a name based on the 88 modern constellations, without a glow. The list goes as following, and do note, again, I can't really pretend to understand weapon naming conventions for 14. The devs are smarter than I am. However, the following list goes as such. For Paladin, Andromeda and Cassiopeia. For Warrior, Hercules. Dark Knight, Eridanus. For Gunbreaker, Reticulum. White Mage, Cygnus. For Scholar, Australis. For Astro, Cercinus. For Sage, Microscopia. For Summoner, Borealis. For Black Mage, Crux. Red Mage, Libra. Bard, Lyra. Machinist, Fornax. For Dancer, Pavo. Monk, Mensa. For Dragoon, Draco. For Ninja, Hydra. For Samurai, Gruss. And for Reaper, Gemini. After you're done with the first step while using the weapons, you can run, unsynced for most of them of course, the trials. I figured in an expansion about endings, a victory lap that has you beating up all the final bosses of each expansion's main story was fitting. I was thinking of including X.3 bosses like Nidhogg and Tsukiyomi, as they are technically final bosses, but Endsinger's theme features only main final bosses, so I figured it fit more to recap those specific ones. Fitting the trials will give you your final finish as Zem weapon. It gives all of the weapons the name Weapon Soul. I'm gonna use the Paladin weapon as an example to explain, but just imagine your favorite job here instead. The weapon soul would glow in the color of the job's main color. Andromeda and Cassiopeia's soul would glow in a deep blue color on the hilt where the aura site rests. An amber Asem symbol rests on the aura site itself, and on the shield the Asem symbol sits on the shield's middle. Covering the blade is a star sign relating to one of the Convocation's crystals. In Paladin's case, this will be Nebrialis' crystal using the star sign Scorpio. I'm personally just going off of colors of the crystals to use. Both the sword and shield would have a sort of firework effect that throws around little star signs. Think of like Paimon's little scarf in Genshin Impact. As there are only 13 convocation seats, not counting Azem, some jobs will have to double up on star signs. But the whole point is to really symbolize the whole calling the stars to your side thing that came with the Azem stone. The Azem symbol will be on each weapon alongside a constellation sign. However, one last quest unlocks on finishing the final main scenario quest of 6.5 Part 2. Rowena arrives with an entourage of people behind her. Gerald's face grows white as he sees people from his and Rowena's past. Now that the weapon's finished, she has one final request before she lets Gerald's contract go. Gerald hesitantly nods. Rowena tells him she wants him to create 2 wedding bands, and asks Gerald to pick up the materials from Ul'dah. She also asks you to accompany him to make sure he doesn't run out to go drinking. The two of you arrive in Ul'dah and pick up Rowena's order in the Avenue Exchange, after which Gerald asks you to join him for just one drink before you two return to Rotted Hans. Gerald tells you that he is fully aware of what Rowena is doing. He's put the pieces together and claims that Rowena is pulling one final attempt to break him by forcing him to work and attend her new wedding. He doesn't know who her new suitor is, but tells you that if Rowena thinks he'll just quietly stand around, she's wrong. After finishing your drinks, you return with Gerald to Rotted Hans and watch as he hammers together 2 wedding bands. Gerald is unusually quiet, and none of the other artisans seem to be around. Just as he finished the bands, an attendant of Rowena takes the bands away and tells Gerald to follow her. She tells you that Rowena asked you to wait in Rotted Hans Tavern and to bring your best outfit. This is a chance in the quest itself to change your outfit. So, you know, if you want to be immersed. You arrive and the entire tavern has been changed into a makeshift wedding altar. Rows of benches and decorations are all around. You find the other artisans all in suits as well, and you're greeted by the confused group. They were forced by Rowena when you left to change the tavern into a wedding setting, and they mention they feel a bit bad for Gerald considering his past with Rowena. Before long, all the seats are filled, and you watch as Gerald is put on the altar. Rumbling to himself and once again put into the suit you saw him in previously, suddenly, before he could ask what's going on, the lights dim and music starts being played by the bards. Rowena walks down the aisle in a wedding dress, and the entire group stands. Gerald is shocked and unable to move or even say something. Before long, the truth is revealed, and Rowena had set this entire thing up to renew her wedding with Gerald, having learned the truth about his whole debt plan from years ago. After Gerald let it slip to one of her subordinates during his work in Gangos, Rowena admits that she was initially upset he didn't just tell her the truth. She decided that the only way to really rectify everything would be to make Gerald work for his own wedding without telling. Gerald tries to continue the act that he's just a drunkard who ran off for love of booze, but quickly changes his tune when Rowena tells him to stop. And so, the wedding continues without a hitch. Rowena and Gerald are now remarried and celebrating with everybody around the bar. Rowena thanks you for all your help both in her professional and now personal life. If it wasn't for you and your interest in Gerald's abilities as a blacksmith, the two would have continued their game of drinking in debt until the next life. Gerald also thanks you for all your help in creating works outside of his kettles, and mentions that now that he doesn't have to continue the act, he's going to try and drink less. He can't live without either of his muses, now can he? As the festivities die down and people start leaving, you and the artisans share one last drink as you look back on this bizarre adventure. Zlatan asks where your adventures are taking you next. You mention that you'll be heading to the New World for a vacation soon. Soon, you leave the party, watching as Gerald and Rowena are entertaining the remaining guests. Your mind starts imagining lands unvisited. You look at the Thavnarian light sky one last time and leave the building, together with the stars at your beck and call. If you've ever wondered how far a man can be pushed after 2 years of lackluster Relic quest story, Well, a 12-page Google Doc for a script and a however long video is the answer, because not playing the game and imagining my own version of the Relic questline is better than being annoyed about the state of affairs of the game currently and actively paying for it. Recently, I even got blocked on Twitter because a lot of Final Fantasy XIV players feel the need to jump to defend the developers even though the game has some genuine issues. That was kind of funny though. Arguing on Twitter, or the site formerly known as Twitter, with somebody over an opinion on a fucking MMO of all things means everybody is a loser in this scenario, including me. I feel that wrapping up the Geralt storyline in ENDWALKER would have been fitting by also tying in Rowena's relationship with him. Rowena will obviously continue being an NPC when we arrive in Tulal in 7.0 and find that she was already setting up shop in the area and your tombstone grind continues. But as for Geralt, wrapping up his storyline and finishing off his arc would be perfect in ENDWALKER. We can then focus on a brand new set of NPCs in 7.x and beyond, no longer needing him for his blacksmithing skills. Of course, eventually the second story arc of Final Fantasy XIV will end in the same way with its own ENDWALKER. So who knows, we could have potentially had a mass team up between every Relic NPC that we meet in 7.0 and beyond and the original crew from the first arc. But alas, they already announced Hildebrand is also continuing in 7.x, so Geralt will just continue being a depth slave well until the end of the game. Am I excited for Dawntrail? Sure! Much like Sonic, Final Fantasy XIV has its grips on me no matter how much I dislike the current state of affairs in the game. I still like the story, I still like the trials, I'll probably just be going hyper casual, unless the side content is stupidly good, and I'll continue paying month by month by month. But hey, the copium for another exploratory zone is still alive with the recent Famitsu article, although part of me fears when Yoshi says they're discussing what to do next, he means it's not coming in 7.x. But hey, as long as the Relic questline isn't just an enhanced tome weapon grind with no story except for Godbird practically jerking off on your tools this time around, I'll objectively be happier. I do want to point out, this video wasn't made with I can make a better grind in mind. It was more, here's an idea of an actual questline. I wrote down the steps on how to get the weapons because I felt it would be empty without some explanation as to why you're doing certain stuff. But this video, as hinted by the clickbait title, was about the questline itself, not the grind. But tell me what you think. Do you like the idea for an alternate ENDWALKER quest? Do you hate it? Should I expand that Corvus Highland open zone idea into a video? Why don't you tell me in the comments below? Also, while I was making this video, I drew up that Corvos map twice, and honest to God, I showed the first one to my friends, and the immediate response was, bro, that's just Calusia. And honestly, I can really see it. I was wheezing. I mean, how much of an impact must the zone have for me to just rip it off from memory without ever realizing? Like, I drew that from memory. I didn't have a A14 map with me. I was just like, oh yeah, I'll just draw some shapes. I don't know how to end this video.